Welcome to the CEC Report. It's the 27th of February. I'm Robert Barwick and I'm joined today by Jeremy Beck. Welcome, Jeremy.
Thanks, Robbie.
In this week's CEC Report, more questions about ASIO's role in Sydney siege and refuting climate alarmism. The CEC answers the Royal Society. So first, more questions about ASIO's role in the Sydney siege. Jeremy, things got pretty heated in national security terms this week. Tony Abbott made a national security statement on Monday, and he made it in front of no less than six Australian flags. Right, this was serious. He made it at the Australian Federal Police headquarters, but it didn't take questions, and it was a whole big staged affair. But it was pretty chilling because what they're doing is it's a ramping up of fascism.
Definitely.
Right?
I mean, you look at what are you more likely to die of? A terrorist attack or a car accident or any other cause?
Well, that's a good point, but they would like to make it out to be, be afraid, there's one behind every corner, etc. That's the impression at the moment. And we want to deal with that because we're going to focus in on the agency that's benefiting the most from this climate that the government is creating, ASIO, right? The powers and resources being channeled to ASIO are incredible, and if you accept the line you're being spun, you'll think, oh yeah, there's a threat, they're the protection, so we should. But if you look a bit deeper, you realise, well, hang on, are we putting the fox in charge of the hen house here, right?
They wanted the terrorism laws all along anyway.
Well, exactly. Cui bono, who benefits? So, in this speech, to me the most chilling part was when Tony Abbott singled out Muslim leaders, and he was quite menacing when he did it, and people have probably seen that on the TV. Muslim leaders need to speak out more often, and of course it's calculated to be divisive. I know personally, Jeremy, you'd know if you know people in the Muslim community, they're speaking out all the time, right? To their community. This is, if you have a caricature image in your head of a Muslim that is some kind of towel head wearing terrorist out to get you, you have no idea what the Australian Muslim community is actually like, right? But of course, there's extremists in that community, and there's extremists in every single community in Australia. To single them out is ridiculous. But in this speech, Abbott announced a whole new raft of measures that are going to deal with this terrorist threat, and he also announced that they're probably going to set up what they call a counter-terrorism czar to oversee the whole thing. And who's the likely head of that czar? The guy who's the head of ASIO, right? Now, I don't want to make too big a deal about this part because it's yet to be confirmed, but the current head of ASIO, Duncan Lewis, he's a former Major General in the Army, fine. He's former Special Forces, and to me that's a slight concern because there's a lot that Special Forces are used for that are totally outside of any democratic accountability. The public will never know, right? So that can be a concern. He's the former ambassador to NATO. Now this sort of is the big issue here in him personally, because a lot of what Australia is being expected to do at the moment in this regard is part of a globally coordinated agenda, right? And a lot of it ties in with how NATO operates as well. And there's a press release we put out last September about the British foreshadowed ahead of a NATO summit that terrorism might be the excuse for NATO to go to war with Russia, right? And so we're worried about the orchestration element of that. Anyway, here's the thing. When they're talking about the head of ASIO being made the head of this new, counter-terrorism czar, there's the problem right there. Because when we're looking, Jeremy, at the Sydney siege, there's so many questions about that particular incident, and the questions, the most disturbing questions are about ASIO itself, right? So what we're saying is ASIO should be investigated, not given more powers. And people might be surprised by that, but when you have an organisation that can function outside of public scrutiny and have this enormous power, that is a dangerous that has a lot of dangerous potential, and we fear that that's exactly what's happening. Now, the day before this big statement by Abbott, he and the Premier of New South Wales, Mike Baird, they released their joint report into the Sydney siege. And in that report, which it was conducted by the heads of their department, and some people have called it a bit of a rush job, but anyway, there's some interesting stuff in there. Before I go through some of the details, I just want to remind the viewers what we in the CEC said last month in a press release. We put out a call for ASIO to be investigated for its role in the Sydney siege. We said the inquest should look at ASIO, and we quoted Mamdouh Habib. And Mamdouh Habib was one of 2 Australians at Guantanamo Bay who was never convicted of terrorism because he was never involved in terrorism. It was a total betrayal of him by his government, and specifically by ASIO. Mamdouh Habib has a personal history with ASIO, and he proved that ASIO, this agency that supposedly we think is on our side, ASIO traded him as an Australian citizen to Egypt for torture, and they were present when he was tortured. And he claimed that for 6 years after he got out of Guantanamo Bay, it was denied the whole time, and then in 2011 an Egyptian official came forward and confirmed it. And when they confirmed it, the Australian government quickly dropped their opposition to what he was saying. They tried to quietly settle the case financially out of sight. And I have personally seen an interview between Habib and an ASIO official where the ASIO official says to Habib, "You have every right to be mad and angry at this country." They know that they were caught out and they tried to wash their hands of it, right? ASIO did that, and if we published in our publication recently the story of what was done to Habib, and it was brutal. It was vicious.
Chilling.
Yeah. The fact that it can be done with the complicity of this agency, people need to question what this agency is. So that's just the way I preface what they said. So what did this report reveal? It revealed what Mamdouh Habib had said to us. Mamdouh knew from talking to Monis, he had met Monis in 2007, and because Mamdouh had an experience with ASIO, ASIO came up, and he knew from his discussions with Monis that Monis also had a very close interaction with ASIO constantly, right? And to the extent they called it harassment. And this went back to when Monis first arrived in Australia, and that was confirmed in this joint report that was released last Sunday. And in fact, here's how extensive the contact was. Monis's ASIO file, they admitted, is thousands of pages thick. Thousands, right? This is extensive contact with this guy. But then this was the kicker. And people might have seen this, but it sort of got a bit of coverage at first, but not enough. The Sydney siege was the 15th of December. ASIO, via the National Security Hotline, took 18 calls of complaint about Monis, not in a year, not in a month, not in a week, in 3 days from the 9th of December to the 12th of December. That's the Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday, the week before, right? 18 calls of complaint in 3 days. And they did nothing. And they said, and Abbott repeated their excuse, in a sense approvingly, because it became an excuse they need more resources. They said it did not meet the threshold for action, and then their excuse was the threshold has to be high because we've only got so many resources. And they pointed out there's something like 400 active investigations they've got underway at the moment into terrorism and stuff. And in that context, these calls about someone, Monis, didn't meet a threshold for action. And my question was, Jeremy, so hang on, in those 3 days, where they get 18 calls about one guy, does that mean they're getting more calls than that about other individuals, right? That they don't even go around and visit him. ASIO claims they don't even go around and visit him, right? I mean, this is bizarre. And I don't think we can trust anything we're being told about this at the moment. So, on top of that, then you have the facts about the Sydney siege itself. And the big issue was the police, get a certain amount of criticism for different decision making. ASIO was involved in that decision making. In fact, I'm convinced ASIO would have been calling the shots. These are joint terrorism task force operations, and that means it involves the state police, the federal police, and ASIO. ASIO, every terrorism arrest people have seen on TV is a joint terrorism task force arrest, always involving ASIO. ASIO calls the shots in these operations, right? And they, you know, would have been calling the shots in the Sydney siege. And so in that context, the big question was, here you had Muslim community leaders offering to negotiate with Monis because they knew him. Habib was one, there were others, and you yourself had a conversation this week with another one.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. I spoke to a very prominent leader in the Islamic Muslim community, and he said, look, I knew Monis. I knew he wouldn't hurt anyone. I mean, he would be easy to convince to, you know, surrender. I knew him, and they turned down my offer. So
now, and I'll have to say, look, you know, when you hear them say he wouldn't hurt anyone, well, officially, it looks like he's hurt someone. But so you can't think, well, you can think, oh, well, that guy's an idiot who said that. On the other hand, it's a common refrain. I've heard that more than once. The people are astounded that the person in the cafe that did this was the Monis that they knew, right? Mm. And that could mean anything. Someone who snapped or whatever. The problem is you can't tell, and because they treated it as a terrorism thing when probably it should have been treated more as a deranged hostage taker, not dissimilar to, you know, a father in a custody dispute, which happens all too often, and that applied to Monis as well. He'd just lost contact with his two sons over the phone. He'd been cut off contact, and that's what made him snap. You know, it was treated in a certain way, and that ended up in the outcome that it did.
Well, his buttons could have been pushed and he could have just snapped, and normally he could have been convinced if ASIO or the authorities accepted the offer from the Muslim community, but they didn't.
Yeah. So here's the thing though, I want to just play for the audience a little clip from YouTube because it gets to what our suspicions are about. And this clip shows last year Human Rights Watch in the United States released a report into the FBI. And the report shows that the FBI, a lot of what the public are told are big terrorism arrests, oh, we busted a terrorist ring, were nothing but sting operations by the FBI where they did everything. And they set up some poor schmuck to be the fall guy, but they provided all the resources. So we'll just play that clip quickly.
We begin with some new and chilling details about a terror plot.
A group of young Muslim immigrants
hatched the terrorist plot at a local mosque.
Ringleaders of a homegrown terror cell were arrested as they tried to buy AK-47 and M16 assault weapons.
Since the September 11th attacks, there have been over 500 people prosecuted for terrorism-related offenses. And this is a number that sounds really big, and it makes it sound like Americans are being kept safe from terrorism attacks. But we found that in a lot of these cases, people were prosecuted who never would have committed a terrorist act in the first place if it weren't for the involvement of the FBI.
While Dowd is charged with attempting to use a weapon of mass destruction, it was a plot largely engineered by the FBI, during which the teenager is accused of taking the bait.
Okay, and that tells you, people can go and look for that. That's a Human Rights Watch report. We did a press release on it in 2013. In April 2013, people can see that on our website. And the FBI, Jeremy, is the counterpart of ASIO, right? It's a domestic spy agency in the United States, right? And they were caught doing that, and we want to know what sort of tricks ASIO actually gets up to. But anyway, just to conclude this segment, Jeremy, back in 2002, you were involved, though, in producing this newspaper. I remember you were heavily involved in it, and the headline was, this is our New Citizen, Facing the Depression, a Fascist Police State or Economic Development. And isn't that where we're heading now?
Well, that's right, and we warned it back then, and nothing was done. We didn't have the investment in the infrastructure, the economic growth. And what do you get when people are unemployed and you have various intelligence agencies recruiting people to various terrorist operations? I mean, look, it was the CIA that was meeting with Osama bin Laden. This is how it works.
Yep.
And here we've got now the economic crisis and the conditions where terrorism will flourish.
Yep. All right, well, we have to leave it there. When we come back, we're going to change the subject to climate change. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Refuting climate alarmism. The CEC answers the Royal Society. So, Jeremy, well, let me preface by saying this. On 2 nights ago, I was watching the 7:30 report, and they did a story on the weather in the United States, and it's very cold. Like they're breaking records for cold, right? And this guy in Washington, this weather guy, was being asked. He said, "Should we expect more of this in the future?" And he actually said in his answer, "Well, one event doesn't prove global warming, but he was basically implying, yeah, this is global warming. They're talking about record cold, and he's implying it's global warming." So anyway, to me, it was totally bizarre. We've had a lot to say about this long before most other organisations, way before, and we're not funded by the oil lobby or anything like that. So anyway, the Royal Society, which is the peak science body in the UK, has produced a primer on climate change where they've compiled 20 questions, and so that people can know that this is the state of climate change knowledge as we know it now, and they sort of seek to deal with every sort of bit of scepticism out there. So we've done it. You and I collaborated on this our publication this week to answer those questions, and we're just going to spend the rest of the CEC report going through the Royal Society's questions and our responses to those. Right. So the first question was, is the climate warming? And the big answer was yes. The Earth's average surface air temperature has increased by about 0.8 degrees Celsius since 1900, with much of this increase taking place since the mid-1970s. So what's your response to that?
Well, it really depends. Is it warming? Well, for the last 18 years, it hasn't. If we look at the satellite records, there's a bit of an up and down along the way, but it hasn't warmed. Statistically, there's zero warming at all for the last 18 years. And
they've got a graph of that people can on the screen now.
If you go back further, true, we've had a little bit of mild warming for the last 100 or 200 years, even longer actually. You go back to the Little Ice Age, temperatures were definitely colder then. They had these fairs on the ice on the Thames River, and it was cold back then. But if you go back further still, well, you had the medieval warming, you had the Holocene climate optimum, and it's gone up and down for thousands or millions of years. So it depends, and if you go back further, if you go back 5 million years ago, it was quite a lot warmer. If you go back 450 million years ago, well, there was an ice age, and there's been several ice ages.
Yeah, and we can put this graph up there, but if you take, this is the one that about 5 million years of climate change from sediment cores, if you take that time frame, because it's all about time frames, right? Yeah. If you take that time frame, then the actual trend is overall towards a cooling.
Well, you have this cycle of up and down with what's called Milankovitch cycles, and they're the Earth's orbit around the sun, and it varies a bit. The tilt of the Earth changes, and it's on a bit of a wobble, and the distance from the sun slightly varies, and whether it's elliptical or circular or all these orbital changes obviously affect the amount of energy coming, and it does change, and you'll have an up and down along the way, and every 100,000 years we've seen major ice ages for the last hundreds of thousands of years. But overall, there's been, for the last 5 million years, there's been a cooling trend.
Now, in our Australian Almanac publication of this, Jeremy, you used a map called the Aurentius Phineas map of 1532. Now, we'll put this up on the screen. What does this map show people?
Well, if you look there, you'll see Antarctica in the bottom right-hand corner. Oh, sorry, that's South America, and then Antarctica is above.
So on the right-hand side of the map is South America. So it's the bottom of the world. You're looking at the bottom of the world.
Yeah, it's the southern hemisphere there. So in the top right, you'll see Antarctica, and it's an ice-free Antarctica. Now, this map was sourced from a lot of archives from the ancient sea mariners, and Professor Charles Hapgood has written a whole book on the ancient sea kings and has identified that there were some advanced maritime cultures going back several thousand years ago who circumnavigated the world, drew detailed maps of Antarctica, including where the Ross ice shelf is right now. It's the Ross Sea, but they would have sailed all the way around the Ross Sea with no ice shelf, so Antarctica would have been considerably warmer, which proves that a few thousand years ago temperatures were quite a lot warmer.
When CO2, by their measures, was supposed to be lower than now. We'll take a break. We'll continue this on the other side. All right, welcome back to the CEC Report, where Jeremy Beck and I are discussing the CEC's answers to the Royal Society on climate change. So before the break, we saw an old map of Antarctica being ice-free in a period of human civilization when supposedly by the climate scientist measures, the way they measure it, CO2 was supposed to be lower than now. So the Earth must have been warmer when it was lower. We've got an example though. We'll put this graph up on the screen. So you provided this this graph that goes back 600 million years, and you have the blue line. The black line is atmospheric CO2, so it's jumping up and down, and the blue line is average global temperature. And what does that show you 450 million years ago? That's a big contradiction to the main general idea about CO2.
Well, there's an Ordovician ice age 450 million years ago, but at that time...
It's a sudden trough in the blue line.
Yeah, at that time, CO2 levels were above 4,000 parts per million.
So hang on, 4,000. Where are we at now?
Well, we're not even at 400, we're about 397.
397 parts per million. They were 4,000 back then, they still had an ice age.
More than 10 times the level of carbon dioxide.
Okay, so that's an interesting thing. Now, we have another ice age picture just for Australians to bring it closer to home. What does this show you about Tasmania?
Well, that's not that long ago at all. That's when the Aborigines walked from the mainland to Tasmania 12,000 years ago. It's like a blink in history when you look at the big scheme of things. And sea levels were about 100 odd metres lower, so there's literally no Bass Strait there. You could walk straight from the mainland to Tasmania. And
that's the point of that, is to show that climate change has always happened. All right. Now, Jeremy, this is slightly more. This is probably there's only a couple of more pictures we want to show. Please explain this. The question that the Royal Society was asked: is there a point at which adding more CO2 will not cause further warming? And they say no, it'll always cause more further warming. So you provided a graph here that shows the logarithmic nature of CO2. So can you explain that?
Well, technically speaking, the Royal Society was correct. If you keep adding more CO2, there will be a little bit more warming. But the thing is, it's minuscule. If you look at the graph, it goes up and up and up very steeply, and the first 20 parts per million of CO2 causes about half of the warming effect that we see now. And then it levels off. And we're at the point now where you could double, triple, quadruple the amount of CO2 and it'd provide the most minuscule increase in warming effect. So really, what's the big deal?
It gives people perspective, because they keep thinking about, it's going to have like a linear effect, and it's not. There's no way it is. All right, and then just one last thing at the time we've got. Explain this graph here, because a lot of this, the bottom line with all the projections about climate change, it's all based on computer models, right? And what does this graph show you about the exact computer models that they use?
If you look at them, there's 73 climate models, and they're all sitting above the actual observations. Now, they're linear trends, so in reality there's going to be a bit of an up and down, but it'll look like spaghetti. So we've just looked at the linear trend of all the models and a linear trend of all the observations, and all of the models predict this massive warming, and even the more conservative models still predict more warming than the observations.
All right. Thanks very much, Jeremy. That's it for this week's CEC Report.